Well, back in New Zealand, I didn't work until 1971, when the youngest child went to school. At that stage, I was asked to help out for 3 weeks at Jubilee Hospital, which was an old ladies' hospital in Woolston. I had to do a retraining course then, which I did at Christchurch Hospital with Jania Matthias. And that I found very scary, because there seemed to be such a big gap from actually being with patients after all that time. But she covered a fairly wide area of general patients, and I went to Jubilee part-time. In 1974, Joan Durbidge was head of physio in Canterbury, and she came and asked me if I would mind moving, because there was somebody else who was ready to come back to physio, but she had a bicycle, as I did, but no car, and she would like to work near Jubilee home. I was cycling right across town to get there, but the other person didn't want to go a long way. I didn't have to leave Jubilee, but if I did, it would help to let this other person work there. And I had a choice of Christchurch Hospital or at Sunnyside, which was a psychiatric hospital, which was fairly new. They'd just recently appointed a young Australian physiotherapist, Sandy Taylor, there, and she felt they needed another physiotherapist. And I chose to go to Sunnyside because it was a new, exciting field and quite utterly different from anything I'd done before. Now, the interesting thing there was that the whole hospital was changing. Edwin Hall was the one in charge, and he was opening up the hospital away from its closed walls. By the time I started, he'd got the walls down and was encouraging people to come in to get to know what was happening in Sunnyside. Patients were being allowed out more. The treatments were changing. It was when there were beginning to be some new drugs. And just the whole feeling about treating psychiatric patients was changing. So I was there at a changing time for physios, for nurses, for doctors, for everybody. And that was exciting. Now, the physios who'd been there before had been part-timers. There'd been 3. Liz Spears was one of the early ones. She was a part-timer. There were the 2 Liz's, and they were both part-timers, and they were treating mainly geriatric patients rather than psychiatric patients, doing fairly normal treatments for geriatrics to keep them mobile. Then Margaret Moon was there for about a year as a part-timer. She began teaching relaxation to some people, and she did work for some time with the psychiatric patients and some of the acute psychiatric patients, but her main work was with the geriatric, psychogeriatric people. But she was one of the early ones. She had an interest in relaxation, and she was teaching some depressed people, anxious people. But she was part-timer and not there for long. Now, Sandy Taylor came about end of 1973, and she was a vibrant young Australian physio. They had had some psychology in their training, which we didn't have any of. And she was absolutely bubbling over with ideas for what could be done in the psychiatric hospital. Until then, they'd really taken very little notice of the physical aspect of people. What went on in their minds was the important thing. And we began the obvious physio way. Sandy was taking exercise classes throughout the hospital in all the areas. She was bringing in a lot more programs of movement of all sorts. She had an interest in dance, modern dance, interpretive dance, any sort of movement, and she was encouraging movement things again throughout the hospital, and she just had so many ideas. The biggest thing, and I think this is important, it's not me, but the biggest thing that Sandy did at that stage was to look at all the intellectually handicapped people, together with a psychologist, Olive Webb, and an occupational therapist, Margaret Miller, Margaret Coombs she was, now Margaret Miller. They did a complete assessments of all the intellectually handicapped people, because until then it was really custodial care for those people. And what they found between the three of them were that a lot of people had far more abilities than had been realized. They found one person with a really fairly high IQ, but because he couldn't talk at all clearly, he'd been just neglected and left. And he got a full-time job, which he was very happy with. I can't remember what he was doing. I was not involved with this group, but we all knew what was happening. They got the wards changed into individual rooms, a lot more activity areas, a lot more outdoor play equipment, sports equipment. They just changed the whole treatment of the intellectually handicapped, and Sandy had a very big part to play in that. Now the other thing that came in with the movement sessions was making things fun, and in the acute areas we found that folk dancing, things with balls, anything that people enjoyed and could laugh with, you'd get so much more movement, and just people changed completely. No, they didn't change completely, but it helped towards their overall getting better. Now, in one of the wards that I was in, there was a habit, a custom. There was a ward meeting once a week at 9 o'clock, following my exercise session. And the ward meetings consisted of the psychologists and the psychiatrists and the nurses, and the physios and OTs, and all the patients. And officially it was not a clinical meeting, it was a what's going on in the ward, what would you like changed, are there good things happening, how are you feeling, is there anything you'd like? And they were terrible. You'd get into the meeting and everybody would just sit. And one of the psychiatrists in particular was he wouldn't ever start the ball rolling. He would just come in, sit, fold his legs under him in the chair, and wait for something to happen. Well, of course it never did. They were terrible. I was told by one of the senior nurses recently, when I had a session at Sunnyside, Hill Norton now, that she was once severely upbraided because in one of these silent periods she started giggling. And that almost counted against her in her nursing career, because you were never to giggle in a meeting. And she said she just could not help it, because here was this room full of people not saying anything at all. Anyway, I realized that in the exercise session, especially when we were doing the folk dancing, the things that involved touching, which was a scary thing for a lot of psychiatric patients, but the folk dancing, they'd be doing, round in a circle, lefts and rights, and doing things in pairs. They'd be throwing the ball They'd enjoy doing it. They were laughing. They'd finish the exercise session, all very happy. Then they knew it was 9 o'clock, and they'd sit down and keep quiet. And they changed completely. So, with a bit of persuasion, I managed to get all the other staff to come into the exercise session at about 10 to 9. And I purposely do things like beanbags and balloons and ball things and folk dancing, which we all make mistakes with. And the patients realized that doctors and nurses could drop beanbags as well as the best of them. And they could make just as many mistakes in folk dancing. And the staff found that they could enjoy doing these things, that the exercise sessions weren't something to be avoided like the plague. And we'd follow straight on from the exercise session, just everybody sat down. And the whole thing just flowed beautifully. They'd talk. They were talking before the doctors came in. And that went on for about 6 months before it fizzled. And I think it helped to break down. It was part of the changes that happened, I think. It probably sounds a bit silly, but it just was that bridging the gap between staff and patients, which we were all trying to do. And I think the doctors then realized, well, physical things can do something to help, because that was important too. They hadn't. We also, with relaxation sessions, the physios did a lot of, we were learning about relaxation techniques. There was more being written. We were learning by teaching and watching and reading, and that became an important part throughout the psychiatric hospital, I think. Another big thing, which I was involved with, was with the people who had chronic schizophrenia. There was a lot being written about something called sensory integration, and this was new. It was mostly Australian occupational therapists who were writing this. They'd suddenly found that if you throw a ball at people, they'll reach out to catch. And if you throw them at handicapped people who don't move very much, they will also enjoy moving. And this was treated in the literature at that time as though this was something new. It was being written about how people with chronic schizophrenia, their general posture, you know, the bent head, the internally irritated arms, if they got involved with ball things, they'd reach up, they'd enjoy it, they'd open up, their whole body opened up. But if you said, stretch up an arm, it would only go a little way up. So I read all the things that were being written and then decided I'd do a pilot study with some of the people with chronic schizophrenia. Some older ones, the long-term ones, but I wanted some of the younger ones who'd been in and out of hospital a number of times, not the newly diagnosed ones. And I talked to all the staff. Research at that time was completely different from now. We didn't have the guidelines as a general rule. We knew sort of how to go about it. But there was no thought of getting a statistician in or anything like that. But to the limit of what I knew, I was setting up a pilot study. And a lot of homework beforehand. And I had a group. I'd been promised there'd be no changes of medication, no changes of general routine, that I'd have a group for 3 months, because I really could try out. And it was a program of daily exercises and activities with a lot of rolling, swinging, ball things, balloon things, reaching, games. They were going to have short sessions daily, but 3 longer sessions. I had a questionnaire written where the nurses were going to observe any changes in activities of daily living. And I had about 6 weeks of cooperation from everybody. The patients had all done profiles of themselves to the best of their ability, drawings of themselves, and it was quite fun. Then it began to fall apart because medications did change. We also got a recreation officer, which was a new thing for Sunnyside. And the recreation officers were taking them out on outings. You know, the whole pattern just changed, so it wouldn't be valid anymore. And one young man watched a program on television one night where they were showing the treatment of intellectually handicapped children, which was doing more or less the same activities as I was doing, and he hit the roof. He was a highly intelligent young man, and he confronted me next day in front of them all and said, "You're treating us like handicapped children. We're not handicapped children." And he was so angry that he wouldn't listen to the fact, well, all right, they have something that's affecting their brain, haven't they? You have something that's affecting. He wasn't prepared to listen at all, even though he did understand his illness to a certain extent. But that outburst and the fact that there were so many changes really just spoilt the whole thing, so it didn't get written up. I wrote up what had happened as far as that, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of them were getting a lot better in daily living things, but that was a pity. That was the sort of thing that Sandy and I were trying to do, new things in, and now of course that would be done automatically. We know these things, and physios would set up some properly organised studies, I think. But it was new for Sunnyside anyway. Relaxation, I said, was new. Biofeedback we were using. Margaret Moon again was interested in biofeedback. She had been at Atlanta in the education, Emory University there, learning a lot about it. She came back to here, to Christchurch, and working with the mechanical engineers, she built her own biofeedback machine and was teaching more of us to use it. And that was exciting. And then they got some from overseas eventually. So we were doing new work with that, tied in with our relaxation techniques. So it was a good time to be at Sunnyside.